Alright, exam 2 review. I will try to make this shorter than the other video, but like I said before, I mean, the difficulty with intro psych isn't really that the material is super hard, it's just that there's so much of it. So I really don't mean to make these as long as they are, but I'm just trying to give you the most comprehensive review as quickly as I can. So, stages of prenatal development, just know the order: zygote, embryo, fetus. Know that habituation is boredom that happens when you're repeatedly exposed to the same stimulus. And usually habituation, we're talking about babies. When they see the same picture or the same toy or something like that over and over and over again, they start to pay less attention to it. They get bored. That's habituation. And then maturation is all the biological components of development that are not influenced by environment, like the fact that you grow taller each year. That happens biologically to everybody. That's not something that your environment determines. Your environment doesn't determine how tall you grow to be. That's a genetic influence. Okay. Repeated presentations of a toy. 2-month-old Anita begins to respond with less visual attention. This is habituation. With repeated exposure to the same thing, we become uninterested. We have decreasing responsiveness to it. Sorry, my cat is eating yet again right next to my microphone. During the course of successful prenatal development, yes, so remember, like I said, ZEF, zygote, embryo, fetus. So we start out as a zygote, finally develop into a fetus. Maturation is to education as nature is to nurture. Remember that maturation is all about nature, genetically influenced things. And education, well, that's certainly not genetically influenced. That's nurture, environment. Okay. A schema is just an overarching concept or a category. So you have a schema of farm animals, for example. Just any kind of category that you can fit other things underneath it. You have a schema for fish. You have a schema for, things like that. Assimilation is a mistake. So this is thinking that something new is actually the same as something you've seen before. So you're assimilating it, thinking that it is similar or the same as something you have seen before. So a little kid sees a gerbil for the first time and they say kitty. Nope, that's not a kitty. You just think it's similar because you've only ever seen a cat as your only example of an animal in your whole life. And so accommodation is the correction of that mistake, understanding the new information and incorporating it into your schema. So once you tell the child, no, it's not a cat, it's a gerbil, then they start saying, oh, gerbil, gerbil, gerbil. Now they've accommodated. They understand that it's something different, and they've incorporated that new term, gerbil, into their schema. Interpreting new experiences in terms of existing schemas is assimilation. But when we modify that schema, that's when we get accommodation. The first time that 4-year-old Sarah saw her brother play a flute, she thought it was just a large whistle, because that's all she's ever seen before. She's interpreting this new experience of the flute in terms of her old experiences of playing a whistle. And so this is assimilation. Because it says her initial understanding of the flute is assimilation. If it said, she eventually came to understand that this was a different thing than a large whistle, then that's the process of accommodation. Incorporating new information into existing theories is to assimilation. As modifying, that's a pretty key word, modifying existing theories in light of new information is to accommodation. Okay. You definitely want to know Piaget's stages. They've been important. They continue to be important. So sensory motor stage, all we have is our senses to interpret the world. So taste, touch, smell, see, hear. That's why babies are always putting things in their mouth, touching everything, sniffing everything, looking around everywhere, because they don't have the capability yet to understand the world in any other way apart from just what they can directly experience. And during this stage, they should achieve an understanding of object permanence, which is the understanding that things still exist even when you can't see them. So if we hide a toy underneath a blanket, that doesn't mean the toy has ceased to exist. It's just not something we can see right now at this moment. Or if you put a toy inside of a cabinet and close the cabinet, it didn't just disappear. It still exists. We just can't perceive it or see it. Pre-operational stage is language but not logic yet. And so we struggle with egocentrism, the inability to take on someone else's point of view. And eventually we achieve theory of mind, where we can actually empathize better and understand other people's thoughts, feelings, perspectives, things like that. When we get to operational, now we can use logic, but basic logic, and we achieve an understanding of conservation. So this was that, pouring a tall glass of milk into a shorter glass, did the amount of milk change? No. That's conservation. And then formal operational, complex logic, and specifically, this is really what's most important, abstract or hypothetical thinking. So you want to know where each of these fall in under the stages, because sometimes it asks a question where you kind of have to know both things in order to answer it, and I have a couple examples of those. So Mrs. Pearson cut Judy's hot dog into 8 pieces and Sylvia's into 6 pieces. Sylvia cried because she thought she wasn't getting as much hot dog as Judy, and so Piaget says that she does not understand the principle of conservation. Doesn't matter how many pieces we cut it into, if it started out as the same amount, it's still the same amount. When Tommy's mother hides his favorite toy under a blanket, he acts as though it no longer exists and makes no attempt to retrieve it. So he's clearly in the sensory motor stage, because it's during the sensory motor stage that you develop object permanence, but he hasn't gotten there yet, so he's still in sensory motor. Cameron counted a total of 8 blocks in a single pile. When the pile was knocked over and the blocks were scattered in front of him, he still knew that there were 8. So this means that he understands conservation. And this is one of those where you have to know we're talking about conservation, and you have to know which stage conservation belongs to, and that's the concrete operational stage. According to Piaget, egocentrism is to conservation as the blank stage is to the blank stage. Well, egocentrism is something that happens in the pre-operational stage. Conservation is something that happens in the concrete operational stage. So our answer is D. So those are those kind of examples where you do have to know where those events fall in the stages in order to answer the question. I have to know not just what conservation is, but what stage conservation happens in. I have to know not just what egocentrism is, but I have to know what stage it happens in. Okay. A critical period is a deadline for a child to be exposed to a normal stimuli or experience in order to develop properly. There's a critical period for language, there's a critical period for basic trust or attachment, things like that. But basically, if you haven't gotten the appropriate stimulation by the time the critical period ends, you will never fully, properly develop in those areas where you experience that deficiency. The Harlow monkey experiments, just kind of know the general setup and findings. So they put a cloth mother and a wire mother with a feeding bottle. So the cloth mother had nothing. The wire mother had a feeding bottle attached to her. And they put baby monkeys inside of this cage with these 2 fake mothers. The hypothesis was when the monkeys are scared, they're going to run to their wire mother because they see her as their source of sort of nourishment, because she provides for them by feeding them. But the actual result was that monkeys run to the cloth mother when they're scared because she is comforting. And so the evidence that monkeys form attachments based on closeness, comfortability, and intimacy, not just basic biological needs, is really the important finding here. And this is what suggests to us, too, that human attachment is about more than just, which parent, or if both parents, fulfill our biological needs. It's also about that closeness, comfortability, and intimacy that you have with a parent or friend or sibling, caretaker in general. Okay, studies of monkeys raised with artificial mothers suggest that mother-infant emotional bonds result primarily from mothers providing infants with, well, it wasn't nourishment because they didn't run to that mother. It was body contact. That's what makes them feel comfortable and close. A critical period is a phase during which exposure to certain experiences is needed for proper development. B is talking about the formal operational stage and Piaget's stages. And the other ones aren't referring to anything in specific. Okay, parenting styles. So remember, authoritarian parents are because I said so parents. I'm not going to give you reasons. I'm just going to tell you these are the rules, them's the rules, and you got to follow them. If you don't, you're getting punished. right? There's no compromise, there's no hearing the child out, it's just my way or the highway. Permissive is the other way around. We want our kids to like us so much that we'll just let them do absolutely anything. They can do anything they want. Who cares? And then negligent parents, though, they do not want to be involved. So that's kind of the difference, is negligent parents, while they're permissive in the sense of they just let their kids do whatever they want, they also don't bother to care for the child. So these parents are not providing their children with adequate food or shelter or something like that, whereas permissive parents are giving their children everything they can possibly give them, and they're just allowing them to do whatever they want. Negligent, I don't even care at all. I don't want to be involved with this kid. And then authoritative is the happy medium, where you get the best outcomes. We have structure and boundaries and rules, but we do encourage that open discussion with the child, and we make exceptions to rules on occasion if they have a good case for why. Brad and Jane exercise very little control over their 2 young children. They usually allow them to do whatever they want. Psychologists would characterize them as permissive. It's not negligent unless it mentions that they're failing to fulfill their basic needs, or just not communicating with the children at all. 2 characteristics of authoritarian parents: they impose rules, they expect obedience. A is authoritative. Don't get those confused, authoritative and authoritarian. This would be categorizing negligent. And this is, again, another description of authoritative. But this is the only one that is authoritarian. Parents who are demanding yet sensitively responsive are authoritative. And authoritative parents are likely to have children who have high self-esteem and are self-reliant. A is the consequence of an authoritarian parent. And then both C and D can be consequences of permissive parenting. Children can be dependent but have high self-esteem because their parents have really built them up, or they could be rebellious, have low self-esteem. Of course, this can also be an outcome of authoritarian parenting too. So moral development, pre-conventional is all about rewards and punishments. I don't want to do it because I'm going to get punished for it, or I do want to do it because I'll get rewarded for it. That must mean it's the right thing to do. Conventional morality, you just take from laws and authority figures. Well, the law says I can't steal, so stealing must be wrong. The teacher says I shouldn't cheat, so cheating must be wrong. And then post-conventional is your own understanding of morality. And it can be correct or incorrect, but it's just you're using your own ethics and moral reasoning to inform your moral decisions. And then you don't have to memorize Erikson's whole thing. You just need to know that identity is the task of the adolescent and intimacy is the task of the young adult. So once we figured out our identity crisis, we move on to that need of intimacy. Okay, avoiding physical punishment is to pre-conventional morality, because remember we were talking about how that's rewards and punishments. And then respecting the laws of society, laws, is conventional morality. According to Erikson, trust is the task of the infant, identity is the task of the adolescent. Mr. Lambers refuses to pay income taxes because his conscience will not allow him to support a government that spends billions of dollars on military weapons. So his reasoning best illustrates the post-conventional stage. Again, he doesn't have to be correct, but he's using his own conscience to inform his moral decisions, and that's what makes it post-conventional, is your own ethics, your own moral reasoning and understanding. Regis thinks it's wrong to drive over the speed limit because he might get punished for doing so, so that is a pre-conventional stage of morality, dealing again with rewards and punishments. Juanita suffers from a painful back condition. Smoking marijuana would reduce her pain, but she thinks it would be wrong because it's prohibited by the laws. So that's the conventional stage. Remember, laws. And then Erikson suggested that The adolescent search for identity is followed by the capacity for intimacy, the task of the young adult. Okay, this is just kind of a summary of the last part of chapter 5. So in early adulthood, we start to see physical decline begin. In middle adulthood is when we see that decline in fertility, which is menopause for women, and a lower testosterone and sperm count for men. And then late adulthood is when we get that hearing, vision, and weakening immune system. But the lifetime of antibodies is built up to prevent cold and flu sickness. So their immune system is weak towards new viruses, like the coronavirus, or things like pneumonia, cancer, etc. But the basic cold and flu, well, they've had so many colds and flus, they're just have so many antibodies, they're basically immune to getting the cold and flu. Okay, Mrs. Wilson, 78, over the past few years, she's become increasingly susceptible to bouts of pneumonia. This can most clearly be attributed to a weakening immune system. Lewis is a 70-year-old retired college professor. In contrast to when he was 30, he now probably does not hear as well, that's true, is more susceptible to catching the flu, not true, has significantly fewer neural connections, also not true, so D can't be true, which means that it's A. Okay, chapter 6. So sensation is just detecting a stimulus at all, so sensation has to do with your senses. So, your vision. Oh boy, I don't know why I decided to draw. Your hearing. Oh, good. Your touch. Yikes. What else is there? Smelling, your nose. These are so bad. And taste, so your tongue. Oh, that's so gross. Now you can see what a horrible drawer I am. So sensation is all about your senses, things that you see, hear, touch, smell, or taste. That was supposed to be a smiling mouth with the tongue sticking out, but it's okay. And then perception is how we interpret and organize those sensations. So seeing something and recognizing the object is perception. Hearing something and recognizing the sound as a familiar melody is perception, right? Whereas just hearing it is the sensation. You've detected that it exists. But perception is how you understand it. And so bottom-up processing deals with sensation. First, we start with the details. We start with the things, the sensation that we have. Someone, grabs your shoulder. The first thing that happens is you feel that sensation, and then you look to try to figure out who it is. Then you try to do the perception. So you start bottom-up with the sensation, and you're working to try to build the perception. And then top-down is the other way around. You start out with your perception, your understanding, and then you break it down to the details, the individual sensations. Jake's excellent peripheral vision enabled him to detect a brief flash of light far to his left, even though he couldn't recognize what he had seen. So this best illustrates sensation because he noticed something. He had a sensation. He saw something. It was a visual sensation. But he couldn't recognize what he had seen, so perception did not occur. Recognizing an odor as the familiar smell of apple blossoms is an example of perception. Smelling the odor at all is your sensation, but the fact that you've recognized it is what turns it into a perception. You've interpreted it as well as being a familiar smell of apple blossoms. Information processing guided by higher level mental processes is top-down processing. Bottom-up processing involves analysis that begins with the sensory receptors. We start out with our sensation and then we build up to our perception. Hearing a sequence of sounds of different pitches is to sensation, as, again, there's that word recognizing the sound sequence as a familiar melody is to perception. Okay, your absolute threshold is the amount of stimulation you need to notice that something is present at all. So if I'm testing your absolute threshold for a smell, then I'm asking the question, how many molecules of the scent is it going to take for them to notice that they're smelling something, right? So if you have a person sitting in a room working on a task, or just sitting there silently waiting for instructions or something like that, and you start diffusing one molecule and one molecule and one molecule more of some cologne into the room, you're waiting for them to either like move their head because they're sniffing something, or have a confused look on their face, or to say, that smells like something. That's their absolute threshold, is the amount of that stimulation, the amount of the molecule in this example that needs to be released in order for the person to notice that the molecule is present at all. Same thing with music. What level of volume does music have to be at in order for people to be like, I think I hear music? That's your absolute threshold, is the amount of stimulation that you need in order to go, I think I hear, see, smell, taste, something. Whereas a difference threshold is you already know that stimulus exists, you've already perceived it, I've already smelled the thing or heard the thing or seen the thing. But what the difference threshold assesses is how much that stimulus has to change in order for you to notice that it has changed. So if I have the volume on level 10 and, slowly you turn it up to level 11, level 12, level 13, level 14, what's that difference that needs to occur in order for me to notice that it's gotten louder? Is the difference just 1? Once you turn it up to 11, immediately I'm like, that changed. Or is my difference threshold larger, and maybe it's like 5, you have to turn it all the way up to 15, and then I'm like, I think that got louder, right? So it's all about, you already know the stimulus is there, but how much difference does there have to be? How much stimulation does it have to change by in order for you to notice that it has changed? And Weber's law just says the difference threshold is only reached when the stimulus changes by some percentage, not by some amount. So if I'm listening to music at volume 10 and it takes you all the way up to volume 15 for me to notice that it's changed, well, if we're listening to something at volume level 50 and you turn it up to 55, I'm probably not going to notice that it's changed, because the amount that it's changed by is such a smaller percentage than when you changed it from 10 to 15. That was like a whole 50% increase. But when you go from 50 to 55, well, that's just like a 2% increase, right? So that's what Weber's law states, is that the difference threshold is only reached when the stimulation changes by a percentage, not by just some amount. Okay. Jennifer can tune her guitar more effectively than Maria because Jennifer is better at detecting whether specific strings are playing too sharp or too flat. With respect to tone sensitivity, Maria apparently has a blank threshold than does Jennifer. When we're not talking about absolute threshold, we're talking about being able to tell the difference between a correct note and a wrong note. And so Maria is not as good at telling that difference, which means that her difference threshold is larger. It takes more for her to notice a change in something than it does for Jennifer. She's able to just hear the tiniest difference in a sharp or flat note. So she has a small difference threshold, a low difference threshold. It doesn't take much change for her to realize that there's something wrong with the note. But Maria, it does take more change, a larger difference threshold. During a hearing test, many sounds were presented at such a low level of intensity, Mr. Antal could hardly detect them, so they must have been below his absolute threshold, because he couldn't even notice that they were there. Julio's bag of marbles is twice as heavy as Jim's. If it takes 5 extra marbles to make Jim's bag feel heavier, it will take 10 extra marbles to make Julio's bag feel heavier. And that is all... Oh, I totally put the wrong answers here. LOL. I'll fix that in the version that I send out to you, but this is illustrating Weber's law. I think I literally just copied these answers down here, so I will fix that. The answer to this is Weber's law. Yeah, but in the PowerPoint that you get, you won't have those answers. I'll put the correct answer choices down there. Okay. So signal detection theory just says that our absolute threshold depends on our expectations, motivations, emotions. So I think the easiest one to give an example of is expectations. So using that example of testing the absolute threshold with molecules of a cologne or something like that. Look, if I tell this person, hey, in a minute you're going to start to smell cologne. Well, now all of a sudden their absolute threshold is so much lower because they are expecting to smell it. So the moment that they even get like a few molecules in there, they're going to notice that it's there because they were expecting to notice it. So the main thing here for signal detection theory is that it's going to say something about the absolute threshold changing or lowering in response to some kind of environmental condition. And then sensory adaptation was this idea that if we stimulate a sense repetitively, or we have constant stimulation on it, our senses adapt and begin to ignore that stimulation. So when you put on a sock, you do feel it touching your skin for a minute, and then your senses adjust. They adapt to the sensory experience. Or when you're listening to loud music, after a few minutes it doesn't sound loud anymore because your senses have adjusted. Okay. The constant quivering movements of our eyes enable us to minimize sensory adaptation. So the whole idea here is if sensory adaptation is something that our bodies do, they start to ignore stimuli that are constant and unchanging, well, that would be a problem if that was the case with vision, right? Because then we couldn't stare at anything for too long without our vision just giving out on us. And so we have these constant quivering movements of the eyes so that we're actually not staring at the same place for too long. And you can try it. Try staring like literally exactly at one spot and not moving your eyes at all. It's hard to do. Your eyes constantly quiver because we want to minimize sensory adaptation so that you can continue to visually perceive things around you. Okay, which theory emphasizes expectations and motivations influencing the level of absolute thresholds? Signal detection theory. Which theory would suggest that that watching a horror movie late at night could lower your absolute threshold for sound as you tried to fall asleep? Signal detection theory. So what this is saying is, if you've just watched a horror movie and then you go try to fall asleep, any little noise that you might hear, you're going to hear right away because your absolute threshold is lowered because you've just had the experience of watching a horror movie and it's sort of elevated your sympathetic nervous system and created you to be, or caused you to be more hypervigilant or more aware of the things going on around you. That's what this is really communicating. After listening to your high-volume car stereo for 15 minutes, you fail to realize how loudly the music is blasting, this because of sensory adaptation. Which theory predicts when we will first notice? There we go, first noticing is that absolute threshold. A faint stimulus among competing background information. This is, again, signal detection theory. Okay. So know that most rods and cones are going to be found in the retina, but most cones are in the fovea. And fovea is where all of your cones are clustered in the central focal point of the retina. And then the blind spot is just where the optic nerve leaves the eye. We do also have to address these two theories. Trichromatic color theory just says there are 3 color-sensitive cones in the eye, one for red, blue, and green, not yellow, red, blue, and green, and that the stimulation of any of these 3 color-sensitive cones can lead you to perceive any color on the spectrum. Opponent process theory says your cones tire out from staring at one color for a long time, so you actually get bounce back from the color on the other end of the bipolar cell. So if you stare at red for too long and then you look elsewhere, you see green. That's your flashback, your bounce back, because your red cells have become bored, sensory adaptation, essentially. Blue goes with yellow, black goes with white. And just know that your visual stimuli supposedly first go through the trichromatic color theory. They stimulate one of those 3 cones. And then after that, you experience opponent process theory. So trichromatic color theory, I've just looked at the sun and I can see it, perceive it as yellow, and then I look elsewhere and now I get that flashback, that like kind of purplish, blue or purplish after image. So because it's an after image, it comes later, second. Which receptor cells most directly enable us to distinguish different wavelengths of light? Remember that wavelength tells you color. So if you have a long wavelength, that's going to be some warmer color like red, and a short wavelength is going to be a color like violet. And so which receptor cells enable us to distinguish different wavelengths, or rather, distinguish different colors? Cones. I should have mentioned this on the last slide, but remember that cones are for color and fine details. rods, or for contrast, so like dim lighting essentially, and black and white vision. So rods are more light sensitive and less color sensitive than cones. So rods are for black and white vision or contrast, which is why they're more light sensitive, but they don't see color. They only see black and white, so that's why they're less color sensitive than cones. Damage to the fovea would probably have the least effect on sensitivity to what kind of stimuli? Well, the fovea is where your cones are. So damage to the fovea would have an effect on seeing brilliantly colored stimuli. Damage to the fovea would also have an effect on your sensitivity to finely detailed stimuli, because cones are for fine details as well. And so it would have the least effect then on dimly illuminated stimuli, because that would be a function of the rods. And there are no rods in the fovea, just cones. The processing of color begins with the activation of cells sensitive to one of three colors. Be careful not to select yellow, red, green, and blue, and then opponent process cells are the second part of that process. When most people stare at a blue circle and then shift their eyes to a white surface, the after image is yellow. So it's just knowing the pairings for the opponent process theory. And people with color deficient vision for red and green may still see yellow. This is most easily explained by the opponent process theory, because the trichromatic color theory says that we have red, green, and blue, and the stimulation of these creates the perception of any color along the spectrum, RGBIV. But if our red and our green is deficient, how are we going to create yellow? Can't happen, right? So the one that explains why people can still see yellow even if both red and green are deficient is opponent process theory, because that says red and green belong to the same bipolar cell. Yellow and blue belong to the same cell, and then black and white also belong to the same cell. So we have damage to the red and green one, but that doesn't affect our yellow, blue, or our white, black. Okay. Gestalt psychology is a branch of German psychology developed by German psychologists. And what a gestalt is just an organized whole of information. And the main point with this is that the whole can exceed the sum of its parts. So to explain that, in looking at this picture, most people would say that's a soccer ball. Well, it's not really a soccer ball because there's no closure to it. There's no actual circle wrapping around this to turn it into a ball, like so. Now it's a soccer ball, right? But without that added information, without actually filling in those gaps, it's not a soccer ball. It's just a random sort of assortment of tilted hexagons, you might say, or pentagons, my goodness. And so what we're saying here is the whole can exceed the sum of its parts. All of these shapes don't add up to a soccer ball, but our brain fills in the gap and turns it into a soccer ball. And that's what we're talking about really with Gestalt psychology. Okay. And then depth perception, just know that that is tested using the visual cliff for infants or for small animals. And retinal disparity is what gives us the ability to perceive depth. So the greater the disparity between the two images you get on either one of your eyes, the closer the object is to you. But the less disparity, the farther away the object is. Retinal disparity is an important cue for perceiving distance, otherwise known as depth perception. I cannot write. Depth perception. Early in the 20th century, a group of German psychologists noticed that people tend to organize a cluster of sensations into a organized whole or a gestalt. The perceptual tendency to group together stimuli that are near each other is called proximity. So these are those gestalt principles. Remember, there's 3 gestalt principles we talk about. It's proximity, continuity, and closure. So you're going to need to know what those are too. Retinal disparity refers to the somewhat different images that our two eyes receive of the same object when we're looking at something. John has more difficulty hitting baseballs that are pitched to him than his classmates do because he was born blind in his right eye. His difficulty is best attributed to a lack of a depth cue known as retinal disparity, because we need both eyes in order to compare the images on each eye, right? Okay. In the middle ear is where we see the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, your three main bones for hearing. And then the cochlea is a fluid-filled bone a little bit deeper in the inner ear. Sensory neural hearing loss always results from damaged hair cells. If we're talking about damage that is occurring to the inner mechanisms of the ear, whether to the cochlea or the hammer, anvil, stirrup, that's going to be conduction hearing loss. But if we're talking about hair cell damage, sensory neural hearing loss, and specifically hair cells that are on the basilar membrane. For conduction hearing loss, whether the issue is with your cochlea or with your hammer, anvil, and stirrup, you can always fix or mediate, I suppose, this with a cochlear implant. And so conduction hearing loss has to do with damage to the processor that actually converts your sound waves into neural impulses or electrical impulses. A cochlear implant converts sounds into electrical signals. Damage to the hammer, anvil, and stirrup is most likely to cause conduction hearing loss. Damage to the hair cells lining the basilar membrane is most likely to result in sensory neural hearing loss. All right, moving on to Chapter 7. So there are two types of associative learning we talk about: classical conditioning, where we associate two stimuli, and operant conditioning, where we associate our behavior with a consequence, whether that's a reward or a punishment. And then cognitive learning is observational learning, where we watch other people's behavior and we imitate it. We also call this modeling, stuff like that. And then stimulus and respondent behavior. So your stimulus is the cause, the respondent behavior is the effect. And you should know too that respondent behavior is always naturally occurring. You don't have to tell yourself to sweat, you don't have to tell yourself to blush, you don't have to tell yourself to salivate. So your respondent behavior is always something that occurs naturally without you having to force it to happen. Respondent behavior is defined as an automatic response to the stimulus. If a sea slug on repeated occasions receives an electric shock just after being squirted with water, its protective withdrawal response to that squirt of water grows stronger. This best illustrates associative learning. I've learned to associate, or the sea slug has learned to associate being squirted with water with receiving an electric shock. The acquisition of mental information by observing events, watching others, or through language is called cognitive learning, or observational learning. Okay, moving on to classical conditioning. So remember that the unconditioned stimulus is the cause of some naturally occurring response, and that naturally occurring response is your unconditioned response. So unconditioned stimulus, hot weather. Unconditioned response, sweating. Every time I'm going to be in hot weather, I'll sweat. That's just a naturally occurring response to being hot, right? Unconditioned stimulus, embarrassment. Unconditioned response, blushing. You don't have to tell me to blush. The embarrassing situation will make me blush unconditionally, right? So a neutral stimulus doesn't cause any effect. So if I ring a bell, that shouldn't make you sweat. If I ring a bell, that shouldn't make you blush, right? It's neutral stimulus. But your neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus if you repeatedly pair it with the unconditioned stimulus. So if repeatedly I ring a bell every single time something embarrassing happens to you, for example, now every time you hear that bell ring, you're going to start to blush, right? Because you're associating that bell with embarrassment, an embarrassing situation. And so understand too that the conditioned response is the same thing as the unconditioned response. It's just what they are responding to. So your unconditioned response and your conditioned response are the same thing, blushing, but it's whether you're blushing because of the bell, because of the conditioned stimulus, or because of the embarrassing situation, the unconditioned stimulus. So unconditioned response and conditioned response are the same thing. Additionally, your neutral stimulus and your conditioned stimulus are the same thing, but your neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. once you repeatedly associate it with the unconditioned stimulus. So once I repeatedly ring a bell every single time something embarrassing happens to you, now the bell has gone from being neutral to being a conditioned stimulus that makes you blush. Acquisition is learning that the association exists, so learning that every time you ring the bell, something embarrassing happens to me. That would be acquisition. Extinction is unlearning that association. So if all of a sudden the person who has trained me starts ringing the bell and nothing embarrassing happens to me, then I'm going to start to unlearn that association and no longer think that the bell is leading to an embarrassing situation. Generalization, you're unable to tell the difference between the true stimulus and stimuli that are similar to it. Discrimination is being able to tell the difference. So off of this example, the bell that they're ringing. So let's say they get a second bell that's a much higher pitch than the original one that they had. If I start feeling embarrassed every time they ring either bell, whether it's the low-pitched or the high-pitched one, that's generalization. But if I only get embarrassed when they ring the lower bell, the one that actually predicts an embarrassing situation, then that's discrimination. I understand that not any bell should cause me to feel embarrassed. Only this specific tone of bell leads to an embarrassing situation. A real estate agent showed Gavin several pictures of a lakeshore property while they were eating a delicious, mouth-watering meal. Later, Gavin was given a tour of the property and he drooled with delight. So this drooling or this mouth-watering is that unconditioned response. And at this point, it is a conditioned response. So we're asking, what are they responding to? Well, the unconditioned response is responding to the unconditioned stimulus of the meal. So we've got unconditioned stimulus is the meal. Our unconditioned response is salivation. Don't have to tell your body to salivate. The neutral stimulus was the lake property, but that then became the conditioned stimulus, right, for the conditioned response of salivation still, but salivation to the lakeshore property instead of salivation to the meal. So the lakeshore property was a conditioned stimulus. I don't like this has changed colors now. At one time, Jimmy was scared of dogs because he was bitten by one. With subsequent repeated exposure to tame dogs in safe settings, his fear of dogs faded. That would be extinction. We learned the association that dogs are scary because they bite, but we repeatedly showed him that not all dogs bite, and so we extinguished that association. The ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus is the process of discrimination. 2-year-old Philip was recently clawed by the neighbor's cat. He now fears all small animals. So even though it was only the cat that hurt him, he now thinks that any small animal is going to hurt him. So that is generalization. Male Japanese quail becomes sexually aroused by a red light that was repeatedly associated. Aha, those words repeatedly associated is what tells you that the red light was the neutral stimulus that became the conditioned stimulus. And so we have to kind of infer what the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response is. Well, it's told us that the response is sexual arousal. And the unconditioned stimulus would be a female quail. Okay, so the sexual arousal that was triggered by the red light was a conditioned response. It was an unconditioned response when it was in response to the female quail, because any female would trigger sexual arousal in a male quail. But the presence of a red light should not trigger sexual arousal in a quail. And so the fact that it has is what makes that sexual arousal a conditioned response, because it's occurring in response to the red light, not in response to the unconditioned stimulus of the female. Okay, this is those reinforcement schedules. So remember that if it says fixed, that means it's consistent or predictable. You know when it's going to happen. If it's variable, it's inconsistent, unpredictable. You don't know when it's going to happen. Ratio is a number of times, interval is an amount of time or a length of time. So fixed ratio, fixed predictable, ratio number of times, predictable number of times. Like buy 5, get 1 free. I know exactly how many times I have to do the action of buying something in order to get 1 free, in order to get my reward. Variable ratio, variable unpredictable, ratio amount of times. So winning at playing a slot machine, I have no idea how many times I have to play the slot machine, but if I keep playing it forever, I have to win at some point. Fixed interval, fixed predictable, interval amount or length of time, like a weekly paycheck. I know exactly how frequently or how long I have to wait until I'm going to get the reward, weekly paycheck. And then variable interval, variable unpredictable, interval amount or length of time, like waiting to see a shooting star. The fact of whether or not the star shoots is not dependent on how many times I look up at the sky. It's dependent on how much time passes, which is why this is an interval, not a ratio. Vice versa, though, if you're looking at the variable ratio example, winning and playing a slot machine, this is a ratio, not an interval, because whether or not you win at the slot machine doesn't depend on how much time passes. You can't just sit there and wait for enough time to pass and then all of a sudden the jackpot releases. No, you have to actually pull the lever on the slot machine some number of times to get that reward. So that's how you tell the difference between ratio and interval. Is it dependent on time or amount of times that you do an action? Partial schedule reinforces response after an unpredictable, so that's already variable, number of responses, ratio. An executive in a computer software firm works with his office door closed. At the same time every hour, he opens the door to see what his employees are doing. So at the same time, that's predictable, right? So that's fixed. And how often? Every hour, every amount of time. So this is fixed interval. Purchasing state lottery tickets is reinforced with winnings on a what scale? Well, is it predictable? Do I know when I'm going to win the lottery? Absolutely not, so it can't be fixed. And then you're asking the question, is it dependent on time or amount of times? Well, it's dependent on amount of times that I purchase a lottery ticket. It's not like I can just sit there and wait, and after a certain amount of time I'll win the lottery. It doesn't work like that. I have to do the action of buying a lotto ticket a certain number of times. I have no idea how many times that's going to be before I win, right? But if I were to just keep buying lotto tickets over and over and over again, as many as I could for the rest of my life, then, at some point I win. Watching the night sky for shooting stars is reinforced on a variable interval scale. We talked about that earlier in the description. On the first day of class, Professor Wallace tells her geography students that pop quizzes are going to be given at unpredictable times, so there's variable. And it even says time, so variable interval. The pop quiz isn't dependent on the number of times that you go to class. It's dependent on the amount of time that has passed where she's decided to give you a pop quiz now. The law of effect is really simple. All it says is if you reward a behavior, that behavior will continue. That's reinforcement. And if you punish a behavior, it's going to stop. Wow, look at that. That's punishment. So again, reinforcement encourages behaviors to continue. Punishment gets behaviors to stop. And so when something is positive, think of that as a math expression. Something is added or given. But if it's negative, something is subtracted or taken away. Positive and negative has nothing to do with good or bad. All it has to do with is whether you are adding something or taking something away. And then again, reinforcement, the purpose is to increase the behavior, so it's a good behavior that we want to continue. And punishment is for bad behaviors. We want these behaviors to stop. So positive punishment, you're going to give something bad, like giving a spanking, so that the child does not do the behavior again. Negative punishment, you take away something good, like you take away a kid's privilege to play. That's a timeout, right? That's a punishment because we don't want the behavior to happen again, and we're taking something away in order to teach that lesson. Positive reinforcement, giving something good, so giving some kind of reward, like giving a child a sticker so that they continue to do the good behavior. Negative reinforcement, taking away something bad, so when you wake up in the morning, you hear that annoying alarm sound. When you get out of bed, you do the good behavior of getting out of bed and turning off the alarm. Now that annoying sound goes away. Okay. So a young child who's spanked after running into the street learns not to repeat this behavior. So if they're not repeating it, then that must be punishment. And they were spanked, that's something that was given to them to punish them. So that is positive punishment. Nothing was taken away. Okay, negative reinforcement increases the rate of response. I don't know where that E came from, honestly. Couldn't tell you. Increases the rate of responding. So that just means operant responding is just referring to whether or not they're going to do the behavior again. So if you're increasing the rate of responding, that means they will do the behavior again, which, if we're talking about reinforcement, they should be doing the behavior again, because that's what reinforcement is for getting a behavior to continue. Whereas punishment is to get a behavior to stop happening or to decrease the rate of operant responding. So increase, decrease should be the answer on that one. Peggy's use of foul language decreased because it was followed by the loss of her $5 weekly allowance. So we've taken away something because we want to stop the behavior, so that has got to be negative punishment. Mason is a stockbroker that runs 2 miles every day after work because it reduces his level of stress. So why does he continue to do the behavior is what this question is asking. And it's because he's got a negative reinforcement happening here. It's taking away something annoying, something aversive, stress, right? So he continues to do the behavior because it brings the pleasurable effect of taking away stress. Oh, oops, same one twice. Well, okay. Intrinsic motivation, you're motivated by the task itself. You don't need extra incentives. Extrinsic motivation, you do need an external reward to be motivated to do the task. So, let's take running a marathon as an example. Someone who likes to run is intrinsically motivated to run that marathon. You don't have to convince them to do it. They want to. They want to do it because they like to run. But, for someone like me who does not like to run, I would need an external reward to be motivated to run a marathon. Someone that's got to offer me money or something like that. And then mirror neurons function for copying behaviors, really. So they fire anytime we copy the behaviors of others and know that they are the basis of observational learning. Mirror neurons are believed by some scientists to provide a biological basis for observational learning. That's how we get modeling effects, things like that. Because Yuri was curious about human behavior, he enrolled in an introductory psychology course, so he was curious about the topic. George registered because he heard it was an easy course that would boost his GPA. So in this instance, Yuri was intrinsically motivated. He wanted to actually know about psychology, so he registered for the psych course, whereas George registered for it because it was an easy A, an extrinsic motivator, a help to his GPA. It's been suggested that mirror neurons are activated when a monkey moves a peanut into its own mouth and when they're just watching another monkey move a peanut into their mouths. So again, this is why it's the basis of observational learning, because the same neurons fire whether you're observing someone or you're actually copying that behavior that they do. Intrinsic motivation refers to a desire to perform an activity for the sake of its own enjoyment. This would be an extrinsic motivator, this would be an extrinsic motivator, and this is just expressing laziness, really. All right, last chapter. So the 4 types of memory. Sensory memory is super, super brief. A sensory memory is a memory of something that you've seen, heard, tasted, touched, smelled. It has to do with a sensation that you experience. And it's really hard to recall sensations. Like, I've pet my cats a million times, but I still can't quite recreate what it feels like to touch my cat in my mind, right? Because it's a sensory memory. Those go away so quick. Short-term memory, you can hold a few items briefly for like a number of minutes. Long-term memory is permanent, and we have not found a limit to it. That's important. We have not found a limit to long-term memory. So theoretically, if you put enough effort into it, you can memorize, the entire dictionary or something crazy like that. And then working memory is a type of short-term memory for the purpose of completing a task. And so your working memory kind of draws from your long-term memory and incorporates information into your short-term memory. Sorry, I totally put that in the wrong place. There we go. So your working memory uses both your short-term and your long-term in order to solve a problem at hand. Completing a task is the goal of working memory. Your activated but limited capacity memory is called short-term. Long-term is limitless. Some information in our fleeting blank memory is encoded into short-term memory. Well, that's got to be sensory memory. Fleeting. Fleeting meaning it only lasts for a few minutes usually, or moments usually, but some of it is encoded into short-term memory. For a little while after petting my cat, I can remember exactly what it felt like to pet my cat, but not for very long, right? The integration of new incoming information with knowledge retrieved from long-term memory. Okay, so integration of new information with knowledge we're retrieving from long-term involves the activity of working memory. Explicit memory, we say that uses effortful processing. We have to actually make an effort to memorize something if it's explicit. This is a memory of a fact or an event, something that you can state about the world, who the first president was, what color the sky is, right? Just facts that you can state. This is also called declarative memory. Declarative, because you can declare it, you can say it, you can proclaim it. And it's the hippocampus and the frontal lobes that are involved in explicit memory. Really, the only one you need to know is hippocampus. Implicit memory we call automatic processing. It's memories of skills and associations. So classical conditioning associations are stored in implicit memory, and so is your muscle or your motor memory. Now, you do want to know which does which. Your cerebellum is for those classical conditioning associations, so all the C's go together, cerebellum with classical conditioning, also operant conditioning. So cerebellum is just for conditioning in general. And then your basal ganglia is that muscle memory, remembering how to do a dance or how to ride a bike, right? Remembering how to solve a puzzle without any conscious recollection that you can do so best illustrates implicit memory. It's below your conscious level of awareness. A conscious memory of the name of the first president, so there we go, conscious memory of the name of the first president is an explicit memory. We can declare it, we can say his name was George, right? George Washington. Which part of the brain plays a key role in forming and storing the implicit memories? Implicit memories created by classical conditioning. So that's how we know that it's cerebellum. Cerebellum and not basal ganglia. Implicit memory is to automatic processing, as explicit memory is to effortful processing. Cerebellum is to implicit memory, as hippocampus is to explicit. And damage to the basal ganglia would most likely interfere with someone's memory of how to play the piano, because that is a muscle or a motor memory, which is something that the basal ganglia deals with, not the cerebellum. The cerebellum is for classical conditioning associations. A flashbulb memory is a vivid memory of something that has emotional significance. Know that those are stored in the amygdala, and they're evidence against repression, because actually the most traumatic events that we seem to experience are usually the ones we can most easily access in our minds, because they become these flashbulb memories stored in the amygdala. The encoding specificity principle says our encoding is specific to the environment that we learn stuff in. So our ability to recall information depends on the memory cues that are available to us. State-dependent memory says you remember things best in the same state you experience them in. So if you were drunk or high versus sober, you're more likely to remember stuff that happened in that state when you are in that state again. It's a memory cue. And the mood congruent memory, when you're in a happy mood, you can more easily recall happy memories. When you're in a sad mood, you more easily recall sad memories, stuff like that. Okay. Joshua vividly recalls his feelings and what he was doing at the exact moment when he heard of his grandfather's unexpected death. That's pretty emotional, so that's going to illustrate a flashbulb memory, a vivid memory of some emotional event. Recall of what you learned is often improved when your physical surroundings at the time of retrieval and encoding, so retrieval when you're trying to pull out the information and encoding when you learned the information, are the same. This best illustrates the encoding specificity principle. This is why really the best thing that you can do for yourself if you're studying for an exam is to study for that exam in the exact same place as you will be taking that exam. So maybe you need to go busting into those classrooms after hours and studying in your class seat, right, for whatever exam's coming up. Okay, this one's a little less clear or less obvious, I suppose, but elevated levels of stress hormones most clearly contribute to developing flashbulb memories, because although a flashbulb memory can be of any emotionally significant event, like even your wedding day or something like that, it doesn't have to be negative, definitely stressful or traumatic memories are gonna be flashbulb memories. So if they've raised your stress hormones, that has somehow affected you to experience a negative emotional event, right? Which you might more vividly recall. Scuba divers who heard a word list while underwater later recalled more of the words if their recall was tested while they were underwater again. So that's another encoding specificity principle. It's harder for Alonzo to recall the name of a workplace colleague when he sees her in the grocery store instead of in the hallway outside of his workplace. So I'm sure we've all had this, where you recognize someone and you're like, I just don't remember where I know them from. Well, if you see them back in that context, now you're going to remember them. And that's another example of the encoding specificity principle. All right, lastly, we've got anterograde and retrograde amnesia and proactive and retroactive interference. The first word tells you the information that you cannot remember. So antero or pro being new information, I cannot remember new information. And then retro, think like, that's so retro, like what a throwback to 60s or whatever. We can't recall old stuff. Amnesia is a condition due to brain damage. Interference is something everybody experiences. So anterograde amnesia, we cannot form new memories. The first word tells you what you cannot remember, what you fail to remember. Retrograde amnesia, we can't recall the old stuff. We're failing to remember the old memories. Proactive interference, we can't remember new information. Proactive, we can't remember new information. Retroactive, we can't remember old information. Okay. So Arnold really easily remembers his old girlfriend's phone number, but he cannot remember the new girlfriend's number. So what are we failing to remember? We're failing to remember new information. So already that knocks out these first two. It's got to be proactive. And it's not amnesia because there was no brain damage involved. It's just proactive interference. After having brain surgery to stop severe seizures, Henry could recall events he experienced prior to the surgery but was unable to form new memories. So unable to form new, that tells you that the first word is either antero or pro, so can't be either of these retros. Is it amnesia or interference? Well, it was brain surgery, so that's going to be amnesia. The disruptive effect of new learning on the recall of previously learned information. So that's what you're focusing on, is what you're trying to remember or recall. We don't care that it's new stuff getting in the way. We care only about what we're trying to remember and we're failing to remember. So it's disruptive. We cannot remember the old stuff because new stuff is getting in the way. So this is not amnesia, this is interference. And like I said, we can't remember the old stuff, so it's retroactive interference. After suffering a severe blow to the head, Maya is unable to remember anything about her past. We cannot remember the past. Her name, where she lives, who her parents are. So we're suffering from, well, this was a blow to the head, so this is not interference. This is actually amnesia, and it's retrograde because we can't remember the old stuff. Failing to remember old information. After learning the combination for his new locker at school, he's unable to remember the old combination. So this is retro. There's no brain damage involved here. It's just interference. So this is retroactive interference. All right. Well, this is not like a totally comprehensive review of absolutely everything you could be asked, but this is definitely representative of the larger points that she's going to pull from. The final exam is not as bad as the unit exams because there are less questions from each chapter if you do the math. And also, she does tend to focus on bigger concepts and less of those tiny detail questions. So take a good look over this PowerPoint and the questions in it, along with the ones from the first exam review. Look over those old practice exams. Those are still a really good representation, and you should really do just fine on this final. Just don't take for granted the fact that there is so much information and think that you can cram for it, because it really just doesn't work that way in this class. Like I said, the information isn't all that difficult, but there's so much of it. So review everything as early as you can. Hopefully you've been doing some review already, but good luck. Good luck on your final exams.